Yeah. Good morning, everyone, and you're welcome back to our channel. It's always beautiful having you here. This morning, we're going to be discussing about hematopoiesis. Hematopoiesis, and this is the process of maturation of blood cells, white blood cells, red blood cells, and all of that. So, when we talk about hematopoiesis, we're basically talking about the process that brings about the maturation of our blood cells, white blood cells, red blood cells, and their platelets. Now, this process occurs in about three major areas of the body. It occurs in the bone marrow of our long bones. So, the femur, the humerus, the tibia, those long bones, those major bones, that's where maturation, or that's where hematopoiesis takes place. It also takes place in the liver and the spleen. So the bone marrow, the liver, and the spleen are the sites for hematopoiesis, and hematopoiesis is that process that brings about the maturation of our blood cells. This process is important, and it's very important for us to note and understand. Now, it's important to note that for these blood cells, they have what we call progenitor cells, meaning they have cells that are their root cells that now develop, maturate, and differentiate to become the different kinds of blood cells that we see. Now, these root cells, there are many different types of these root cells, but it's important to note that altogether these root cells are called multipotent cells. Multipotent cells, and multipotent cells, from the word multi and potent, means that they mature and then differentiate into different other kinds of cells. And this is quite important for us to know. Now, we know that these blood cells have very many different functions, but it's important to know that hematopoiesis takes place in three major stages which hematopoiesis does take place. And now these three stages starts from the first one, which we call the stem cell stage. The stem cell stage, that is the stage at which these cells are within the bone marrow, within the liver, and the spleen. And at this stage, they are at the level of multipotent cells, and at this stage, the cells are formed, and there are two major types of multipotent cells. There are two major types of multipotent cells. There are the ones we call myeloid multipotent or myeloid progenitor cells, and then lymphoid progenitor cells, myeloid progenitor cells, and lymphoid progenitor cells. Now, these two major types of multipotent cells, the myeloid progenitor cells are the ones that mature and differentiate to form your red blood cells, your platelets, and your other types of white blood cells, your eosinophils, basophils, and neutrophils. So these are all different types of blood cells, and they come from myeloid progenitors. So we say they are from myeloid progenitor cells. Now, the other type of cells are the cells we refer to as the lymphoid progenitor cells. And these lymphoid progenitor cells give rise to our lymphocytes. So we have what we call T lymphocytes and we have B lymphocytes. So these T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes come from our lymphoid progenitor cells. So these are important facts to know. Hematopoiesis, there are progenitor cells, and these progenitor cells can be lymphoid progenitor cells or they can be myeloid progenitor cells. If they are lymphoid progenitor cells, they give rise to your red blood cells, your white blood cells, your platelets. And if they are lymphoid progenitor cells, they give birth to your T lymphocytes. If they are myeloid progenitor cells, they give rise to your RBC, your red blood cells. So this is quite important for us to know. Now, this first stage that we've discussed is what we call the stem cell stage. So that's the first stage of hematopoiesis. From there, we go to the next stage, which is the stage of differentiation and maturation. So this is the stage where all these cells begin to differentiate and mature. They start as tiny minute cells that are not differentiated, and then over the time, sometimes they differentiate in an organ called the thymus, for an example, for our T cells. So these different kinds of cells, they differentiate in and mature in all these different cells. So that is a stage. And then the last stage, or the third stage in hematopoiesis, is the stage of the final product. This is the stage where we now have these blood cells have been, they've matured, sorry, and then they've differentiated into these different types of cells. So you now have your red blood cells, for an example, which are involved in carrying oxygen all around the body. They also carry glucose, and then they help to remove waste. You have your platelets, and your platelets are there for blood clotting. You have your white blood cells. These are different kinds of cells. Your eosinophils, basophils, neutrophils, all these kind of cells. You also have your lymphocytes, your T lymphocytes, different types of T lymphocytes. You have your B lymphocytes, different types of lymphocytes. So these are all cells that arose from our multipotent cells. So the whole process is what we call hematopoiesis. This whole process, and this is the process by which we are able to form blood cells that have different functions within the human body. Thank you for listening to this. You can take your time to go through the video again and understand these concepts. Do have a wonderful day. Remember to like, share, subscribe to our content, and have a blissful day. Thank you.